Hello, welcome to this week's edition of InFocus Recouched with Kent and Dora.
It's great to have you with us. Today we're taking a look at why ugly food is good for you. Yes, ugly food. And we're going to meet two men putting their passion for the world's poor into action, but in two totally different ways.
Now, one of those two men is Avondale lecturer Brad Watson. So I'm thinking, Dora, that we should call today's episode The Good, The Brad and The Ugly.
But how does this first segment fit in? It's looking at how to revive a stale marriage.
Well, if you've got some stale bread in your freezer, that might be a lot better than a stale marriage, isn't that right, Trav?
It is. It is. I'll go with the stale bread. Look, sadly, there are occasions when our marriages, it's not a bad word, it gets stale. They just get a bit dry. But
we all go through it.
Yeah, look, we all go times when the relationship just loses a bit of its buzz. I think the first thing we've got to do when that happens, because I think there's three. There's a boredom rut, a boredom stale. There's a conflict stale where we just get lost in all that. I think to intimacy, staleness, we get stale in intimacy and we lose all that excitement. Let's talk about the boredom one.
All right.
We call it a rut. We've fallen into the boredom rut. I think there are some things we can do, Danielle. We really can. I think the first one is acknowledge it. You say, hey, we're in a rut. Because if we say, no, everything's fine, and we just roll along, it's going to leave us worse off.
Yeah, so we can kick the white elephant out of the room. And
let's get
call it
real.
out. Yeah.
Let's get real. And it's, okay, look, let's face it, we're in a rut. Good step. Now we can do something about it. I think the second thing is avoid blame and shame. If we do the blame thing, well, it's your fault, so we're kind of externalising the problem.
Yeah.
If we say, oh, this is terrible, and we kind of look inwards and we do a lot of shame about it, then again, it's not going to work. I think we've got to open, honestly say, hey, let's address this without blame, without shame. We've developed a rut. We've just got into the cycle, busy life, the kids, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Let's get real. So I think the next thing we've got to do is some mutual fun activities. Now, why I say mutual is this. If I have a fun activity that I love doing, which is water skiing, and my wife hates it, I say, yeah, let's go water skiing. That's fun. She's going to die.
It's not overly reciprocal, is it?
It's just not on. And I have to tell you, I know this guy who loves snow skiing. And he just lived for snow skiing. So he takes his wife snow skiing. She hated it. She sat in the little villa thing for 5 days in a row. The whole thing died. You've got to be a mutual fun. Even if it's a bit crazy, do something crazy, Dream up something that's a bit out there, Go shopping in shorts that you'd never go shopping. Just do something. Push a trolley backwards. Do something. Let's have some fun here.
Something to kick it a bit.
Yeah, let's get a kick. Make a date. Because I think one of the issues is why it gets stale is like bread in the freezer. It sits there too long, and we just roll along in this kind of pattern. We've got to change this. We've got to make a date, even if it's a mini date. Now, the drama is we often make dates, we don't stick to them. And, a work appointment comes up. We've got to stick to them, right? So if you make a date, nothing takes its place.
So you're talking about making the relationship a priority during that time?
Let's initiate this. And the other thing is hide the remote. Get rid of the, switch the telly off, switch the laptop. It's crazy.
I know, but it's so prevalent.
Tea time, work. No, put it away. Put it away. Our marriages, our relationships, our friendships are so important. We've got to look after them. Yeah. So we've got to get energised about this. Yeah.
It is true, and we're living in such a time of disconnection. That it's
now we've got to fight this stuff. We've got to stay connected. Yeah, exactly.
So we've just got to keep it alive and spice it up, and we should be right.
Yeah, let's get some action out there. Let's have this happen. Exactly.
Yeah, Sue, that's an ugly slug of a sweet potato, don't you reckon, folks? It's called ugly food, and this movement started where?
It started in France, James.
Does anyone buy this?
Absolutely, they do now. Yeah. It actually started back in 2014. A supermarket called Intermarché launched a movement called Inglorious Fruit and Vegetables. And
Why?
It was because in 2014 the EC decided to call that year the year to reduce food waste.
Oh, so how much food is wasted before it reaches supermarkets?
On average, at least about 25% is wasted before it even gets out of the farm gate. So it's a lot of waste, which sometimes goes into making fruit juice or, you know, maybe for stock feed. Sometimes it's given away, but mostly it's just dumped.
Okay.
So it's a huge waste of resources.
Okay,
like
so if I reach
water.
this great big eggplant, it normally would not be sold because it's got, what, some creases and bumps and...
Yeah, things can have warts and bumps, or maybe they're just not the right colour. Oranges might be quite pale looking. But the key message, James, is They taste just as good, and they're just as good for you, nutrition-wise. And you can often save between 30 to 50% of the cost. So that's got to be a bonus for families.
So when I go to the supermarket, I'm looking for something completely unblemished, that's smooth as anything. You just think it's better for you.
Well, that's right. This is what's happened, and we don't actually know what started it all. The supermarkets tend to blame the customers, and they say, look, the customers won't buy anything unless it looks perfectly shaped and the perfect colour. But you know, some people blame TV shows, such as cooking shows, because they're so focused on presentation rather than being focused on the freshness. But what we found is, through some recent research, is people will buy it if they know it's just as good for them and it's going to save them money. But half of the people in Australia, for example, haven't yet sought out these foods.
I've never heard of it again until I heard you.
Well, major chains like Woolworths in Australia, for example, and Harris Farm have sections, such as the ugly bunch or imperfect picks. So you just need to look for that section of the market, and you're going to save yourself money and help to reduce food waste.
How much would you save if you went to the ugly food section of the supermarket?
Well, on average, it's about 30% less.
30%?
Yeah. And what's interesting to me, James, is, you know, only 10 years ago, foods that now are classed as seconds used to be first grade.
Oh.
So this is what I mean by these specifications in supermarkets having become so high that, you know, 25% of what's grown isn't brought into the supermarket to be sold because they think people won't buy it.
That's a lot of food,
Yeah,
boy.
but what happened in France was, when they launched this campaign, not only did it increase traffic into their supermarket by 24%, it launched this huge worldwide movement. They got massive media attention, and so we've got, you know, the major chains in the UK, from Sainsbury's to Waitrose to Tesco's, and even in Canada, Loblaws, have all started to embrace this movement, and luckily in Australia we're also embracing it.
That's amazing. My sceptic's question was, aren't the supermarkets going to lose money, but more people are shopping there?
Well, they're going to sell something that otherwise wasn't able to be sold. And I think the last point we need to remember is, you know, if we all grew up on the farm, we would be more likely to accept any oddly shaped fruit or vegetable. But when we grow up in the city or live in the city, we don't have the same appreciation for what it takes. So I think we need to embrace this. We need to help do our part to reduce food waste, help farmers get more for their efforts, and at the same time, we'll save money for the family.
Okay, well, let's look at this pimply pear. We were trying to think of a name for this with its nice little leaf. It's still got an old leaf.
Yes,
got some humps and bumps.
Some
and you
of
reckon
them,
it's nutritious?
Yes, absolutely. Some of them have the quirkiest names you'll ever hear, such as Lively Lemons.
Now, which section would you go to in Woolies?
Well, they have special sections, and they will actually label that this fruit is not their supposed first grade. But as I say, it's just as nutritious and just as tasty, and you're going to save money at the same time.
You know I'm going to test this out, don't you? Folks, here we go, the pimply pear.
It's just as good.
We're trying.
Such a great idea, and it's awesome to see that even some of the major supermarkets are taking it on.
Yeah, absolutely. But unless we as consumers can be convinced that ugly food is just as good as the other stuff, well, it's going nowhere, basically.
Look, so long as it's cheaper, I think people will buy it, and it's as simple as that.
Yeah, true. Let's take a break now. Stay with us, though. There's more InFocus Recouched coming up in just a minute.
We live our lives running around, rarely stopping to ask ourselves where we're going and what our final destination is. In the end, our lives become little more than routine. Step beyond and discover a path that offers comfort, love and hope. Visit hopeoffer.com/step beyond or call 1300 300 389 for your free copy today.
We're going to start with some soybeans. Use some chickpeas, an onion, you have a teaspoon of salt, slice some tomatoes, slice some cucumber, some red onion just to give it a bit of freshness. So just make little flakes like this. They just smell amazing. Let's make our tahini dressing. Let's get in some tomatoes, cucumbers, some falafels. Drizzle some of this lovely dressing. All you need to do is roll it up and you've got a delicious lunch for your family.
Hi, welcome back. Now, there aren't too many interview guests we've had on the InFocus set 3 times.
Well, there was Dennis Perry. He's been on 3 times. We played his interview a week or so back.
Yes, that's true. And the other is Brad Watson. He's a college lecturer and an author of young adult fiction. But that's not why we had him in the studio in this occasion.
Yep, that's right. Let's check it out. Brad, you head up the Poverty and International Development Studies area at Avondale, is that right?
Yes, I do. It's a job I've been doing for about 10 years.
Okay. And the reason why I really wanted you to come in and talk to us today, Brad, is that a number of our viewers, and myself included, sponsor children. Now, you've done a fair bit of research in this area of child sponsorship. Who invented the idea?
Well, it seems that child sponsorship was invented in about 1919 after World War I.
Oh, wow, that early.
Yes. It looks like the Save the Children organisation was responsible. It was only newly formed then. And it occurred at a time when thousands of children in European countries were starving after the war.
What is the scale now of child sponsorship around the world?
Currently, depending on the estimates, we think there are between 8 and 12 million children who are sponsored. And we think it raises several $billion for developing countries. So it's a very important way of giving. World Vision by far is the largest child sponsor, and they estimate that they sponsor between 3 and 4 million children.
Boy, that's huge.
It's a lot.
And in Australia, Compassion is pretty big with child sponsorship.
It's one of the bigger ones, yes.
Yeah, Asian Aid, you know, we've had some people from that organisation here. We've also had people supporting Compassion here in the studio. So, you know, this is something that is, you know, close to a lot of people's hearts. Now, you've written a book. I know you didn't write every chapter, you edited it, and other experts wrote different chapters, but the book's about child sponsorship. Some people are concerned about that as an approach. Well, why would that be when it seems such a lovely thing to do?
Those criticisms come particularly from the 1970s and 80s, when some very large organisations were growing super fast. Some of their overhead expenses were up around 30 and 40% of the dollar that was going into their admin costs. And what some of those organisations were doing was making sure that the funding that did go to children was only benefiting the children. And so sometimes it wasn't benefiting the community or family members or other poor people surrounding that child. Another issue was that even up until the 1980s, the sponsorship of children in orphanages was still very common. And the big organisations began to realise that they had created orphan rushes. They'd built big, expensive orphanages. Often they weren't administrated as well as they could have been, and often they filled up with children who did have a mum or a dad or an uncle or somebody else in the family who would like to have taken care of the child. Unfortunately...
So this is situations where there's a poor family, they're struggling to look after their kids, and they say, well, I can't seem to get any help for my family, but I know my child can get help if they're considered an orphan, and they go to an orphanage because they're well supported by international donors.
And families were making that economic decision. If we lie about our child's status, we can get them a good future.
Wow.
But some of the big organisations began to say, look, it'd be better for us to help the family than to just take the child and put the child in a institution of sorts.
But some organisations choose not to sponsor children still.
Linking an individual to an individual can sometimes become more about the sponsor. And a lot of money can be siphoned off from the child to make sure that the sponsor receives letters and receives updates, and it can be an expensive way of supporting an individual child. Yes, and to some extent, a number of the leading sponsorship organisations are now doing fundraising with child sponsorship, but they're now also working with communities to benefit individual children rather than only helping out the individual. Look, I should say that I myself sponsor 3 children. And 2 of those children are individually sponsored. They go to a school, but their siblings do not. Their mothers are poor, but the mothers don't receive any help. And as a consequence of writing the book, and this is something I'd encourage all your viewers to think about, is would it be better where possible to assist the family as well as the child, or just to assist an individual child? And I personally am on a journey, I guess, where I'm tending to think it's better to help the family around the child.
The whole family. Wow. Okay. Well, that's one practical tip that I guess we can take away from that, Brad. And any more just as we finish off?
I think it is important to follow your heart to some extent. A lot of giving for us Christians is a spiritual decision.
Sure.
We have a sense of God's Spirit leading us, prodding our conscience to do something for others.
And it's very biblical as well, to help the widow and orphan in need.
Of course it is. And to some extent it is a personal and subjective choice. But one thing to consider is that the different sponsorship organisations go about doing their business differently. And so it's great to do a little bit of homework on who you're going to sign up to.
Sure.
I personally would go for an organisation that keeps less than 20% of the sponsorship dollar for its own
for overheads,
administrative costs. Some are much higher than that, and they disguise the true costs of it. And I personally would also suggest that you go for an organisation that looks at holistic child development. And that might mean that there's some spiritual benefits for the child in that, but perhaps it could be in their own cultural context rather than ours.
Wow, okay. Food for thought there. Boy, sometimes, giving's hard, isn't it? to give wisely.
It is hard, but it's also wonderful. And just to share a personal anecdote, my family have had the opportunity of travelling to India, and we have visited one of our sponsored children.
Oh, wow.
And I, on research with my students, visited one of our girls who was sponsored and was very humbled to have her wash my feet, as is her cultural custom. And all that time I thought I'd been blessing her, and there she was blessing me.
Boy,
so it is very touching, and it can be quite profound. Perhaps the last thing I would slip in is if I can, for 80 years, since the earliest sponsorship programs, sponsored children have been saying, letters are really important to us. Don't just sponsor us, communicate with us. You guys are almost like a god. You're like a dad. You're like a mum. When the money comes in year after year without any communication attached to that, it is confusing for them. You may underestimate it, but they certainly don't, and it can be really treasured. So look after that relationship if you sponsor a child.
Wow, touche. That's something for me to think about, that's for sure. Thanks so much for your time, Brad. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
You know what, Ken? I really think the main thing is that people help one another. Whether it's through a child sponsorship plan or whatever, so long as the money's flowing to where it's needed.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Sometimes, I guess, worrying about if your money is being used in the absolute best possible way, it can be an excuse, because people say, I can't be completely sure if this is really best, so I'm not going to give it all.
Yeah, and that's totally lame. Give smart, but just give, I reckon.
Yeah, fair enough. We'll take a quick break now, but we'll be back in just a minute.
Father, I can't connect the dots through the little that I understand. What words can I say to reach you? How can I know that you are there, listening, hearing, caring? My words are broken, weak, and powerless. But I know your power is limitless. What can I say?
So you think you've got your future all planned out, right? Or maybe you're not sure yet what you want to do, who you want to be, but whatever path you choose to study, a great education matters. Because it doesn't just help you get a great job, it helps you prepare for what life can throw at you and live a great life. Avondale. It's education designed for life.
Hi, welcome back. Now, Dora, we were looking at that interview just before the break that sort of hinted that sometimes charities, despite their good intentions, can actually make things worse. But I don't think that Habitat for Humanity falls into that category.
Yeah, they have a very effective approach, and it seems like they've really thought it through. Let's take a look.
Well, it was only just a year or so ago that the 50% mark was passed of people who now live in cities around the world. And Martin Thomas from Habitat Humanity is here to tell us that I guess a lot of that housing in those cities is not particularly safe or?
No, look, it's incredibly inadequate when you think of it. I mean, it is a phenomenal figure. I think that was a UN figure you mentioned back in 2007, the first time in the history of human settlement that there's more people in cities than in rural areas. And if you think, you viewers might have seen Slumdog Millionaire, these slums that just pan out forever. No safety, police often don't go in there, often no clean water, near railway tracks, all sorts of dangers. And there's something like 500 million people just in Asia alone that live in those conditions. Kids, men, women. And slums in some cases can be quite functional. You can get your hair cut and you can do different things. But in other cases they can be violent places. They can be places where there's disease, where kids don't get to go to school. So it's an incredible mass of humanity that's in huge dire need.
Do we have any idea of the proportion of the world's population that is living in slum or slum-like conditions?
Well, I think it's around about 1 to 2 billion people, and when we think of a population of 7 billion, it's a fair proportion. The problem is it's growing, and for instance in Asia alone, I mentioned 500 million. That figure's set to go to close to 900 million. So it's happening at such a rapid pace. When you look at it at a macro level with the figures, they're horrifying. But when you look at one individual life, I was in Cambodia recently, and just walking down the slums, the smell of a slum, there's gangrenous green water all around the place. You see people brushing their teeth. Everyday life happens. There's rubbish everywhere, and in many of these places there's no organised rubbish collection.
So Habitat for Humanity focuses on building houses, doesn't it?
Look, it does. There's a couple of, I guess there's kind of 2 or 3 key pillars to what we do. We do look at trying to get a safe, decent housing for everyone. No matter how poor, we believe everyone has a right, because we believe that's the start of breaking the poverty cycle. Obviously, when someone is starving or has disease, you need to have a full-on response to that, and organisations like UNICEF and World Vision do that tremendously. But at some stage, to get independence, you need to give people a safe, decent place to live. They've got warmth, they've got light, they have an opportunity for their kids to go to school. So we think it all starts with the home when you're trying to break the poverty cycle.
Okay, so does Habitat for Humanity in Australia focus on particular countries? I mean, you mentioned Asia a few times. Is Asia your focus?
So from an Australian point of view, our office and the supporters that support Habitat Australia support programs in 7 countries across Asia. And some of the booming countries you mentioned. So Bangladesh, Dhaka, we're in Cambodia, we're in Vietnam, we're in Thailand. So basically some of the biggest growth areas with this issue of urbanisation we're looking to tackle.
Okay. And are you building houses within the slums, or are you looking to help people move out of slums to establish something maybe in a more legal area where there's a bit more stability?
Look, we're doing both because of the sheer numbers. We're looking at trying to, it seems odd, but there's a phrase called slum upgrading. But we're trying to look at, there's a mass of humanity there, you can't move them all out. Let's look at ways to basically get better conditions in there.
So you're not just building individual houses, are you working with some infrastructure stuff as well?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we do broad-based community development. We kind of start with a house, but the idea that if you don't have clean water, a house is not much good for you. So we work sometimes with other organisations, sometimes ourselves, to do water and sanitation, looking at other things in terms of access to school, etc. So, yeah.
Now, Habitat uses a unique phrase that I don't think I've heard any other organisation use, and that's sweat equity. Well, what does that mean?
Yeah, well, look, essentially, we talked about houses being a key pillar for us. The other is the involvement of volunteering. So for an individual family that will be benefited from a house, we expect them to put in, to have a bit of ownership. We kind of say, as a lot of charities do, that it's a hand up, not a hand out. So we would require them to do 500 hours of sweat equity, so volunteering on their house in any way they can. And we also...
so people help to build their own houses?
Absolutely, yeah. And then we actually have volunteers that are willing to go. So in Australia, we send about 500 volunteers a year overseas to these countries. And they will work next to a householder and next to local craftsmen who won't speak the language. And for 5 days, you'll be hammering nails, you'll be digging trenches. And on the 5th or 6th day, sounds quite biblical on the 6th day, you get to hand over a key to a family, and you see the difference it makes. And although you kind of think, well, there's so many people, what difference does that make? We had a group go to Nepal recently, a group of women, and they said every day they'd go from their hotel, because we don't make people camp out, so they're staying in a cheap hotel, they'd go to the site and they'd help build, and they said every day the community would just watch them and wouldn't help, and they kind of thought, what's happening here? And slowly the community started to get involved, but on the day of the handover, one of the community elders stood up and said, look, we are really challenged because this was a woman you were helping, a widow, who wasn't very high in our society, wasn't really someone which we would respect. But the fact that you've spent all your time to come over and help this woman has really humbled us. And we're going to make sure that we keep that house maintained for her and we provide support for her because you've really shown us something.
It sounds like a very Christ-like thing to do, really, not in preaching necessarily, but through an example, because Habitat is a Christian organisation, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, definitely. And look, the story is quite amazing. It was started 40 years ago. Millard Fuller was an American. He was a US marketing executive who was a millionaire, had his own company at about 29. But his life was miserable. His marriage was on the rocks. He was working too hard. And essentially they came to a crisis. And his wife said, unless you sell the company, give the money to the poor, we're not going to continue with this marriage.
Wow.
I haven't told my wife this story yet. But so he made the decision and they went, sold their company, gave everything they had, went and volunteered in southern states of America, helping black communities get housing, and ended up in the Congo, in Zaire. Well, Zaire as it was then. But he started something just through that unselfish act. When you think that Habitat is huge across the world. Every 4 minutes, somewhere in the world, Habitat either builds, repairs or renovates a house, and it was from that one man that made a sacrifice.
That's
it's incredible.
So how has working with Habitat impacted you spiritually?
I think to try to do something that makes a difference is really my personal journey, and I'm probably more head than heart. You know, I don't find it easy kind of putting myself outside my comfort zone. Some people love to. But I think for me, there's no moral divide between someone that's in need right in front of you. If you see a kid get knocked down, you'd go and help them, versus someone who's a world away. And the fact is, we can make a huge difference to people who we may never meet, or we may only meet in heaven. But there's a sense that we can do something, and sometimes it might be a few dollars, sometimes it might be volunteering. So in all sorts of ways, no matter how much resources or time you have, you can engage. Doesn't even have to be through Habitat, but I think for an organisation, or for a Christian, sorry, to do something so that when you stand in front of your Creator you can say, well, at least I did something.
Wow. Boy, look, there's so much I could ask you about. I'd like to ask you about, you know, the Vanuatu rebuilding program. That's a big thing right now after the cyclone that hit there. Australia's domestic building program. If people want to find out more about that, or they want to, you know, help you guys out, you know, volunteer, go on a trip, have you got a website that
we do? Yeah, habitat.org.au. All the details there. And there's a lot on there, as you can imagine.
Hey, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, Martin Thomas.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Wow, what a great organisation. It's not one you hear about very often though, is it?
Yeah, you're right, it isn't. But they're out there, just quietly getting it done.
Awesome. Actually, it looks like we've been getting our work done too. It's been a great episode and our time is up for this week.
Yep, thanks so much for watching. All the best. We'll see you next time.
God bless.